Hello, mortals. I am the BookTube Goddess, the #1 drag queen booktuber on YouTube. For the Reindeer Readathon, I reread Dune, the science fiction classic by Frank Herbert, and I want to go over 3 things in this review. First, convince you that you should read Dune if you haven't already. Second, talk about the writing. And third, touch base on the world building. Now, the story, very quickly, is a coming-of-age story of a young teen boy named Paul, set in the far future where humans live in a galactic empire. His father, Duke Leto, is transferred from the lush planet of Caladan to the desert planet of Arrakis, also known as Dune, which produces a product known as melange, a spice that is needed to hold the empire together. Spice does things like give the ability for certain people to fold space and make travel between star systems possible. Spice can also prolong life, like the Emperor is 70 years old, but looks like he's half his age thanks to spice.
The spice must flow.
Why should you read Dune, you might ask? Well, first of all, it is a young adult novel.
Say what?
The main character, Paul Atreides, is a 15-year-old boy, and he never ages beyond 17 years old by the end of the novel. And yes, I'm only saying that for those of you who predominantly read YA to give this novel a chance. I mean, if freaking Red Rising is considered a YA, which, by the way, I don't think it is, but if you think it is, then Dune is just as much of a YA novel. In fact, Paul was described as small for his age. Now, picture a 15-year-old boy small for his age. That is your main character. The first iteration of Dune was published in a serial format in Analog magazine in 1965 and then went on to win the Hugo and Nebula Award. In fact, it was the first ever Nebula Award winner. Now, Dune had a big resurgence during the 70s when ecology became a big trend in the public consciousness. And frankly, it's been in bookstores as long as I can remember. In fact, Dune is the world's best-selling science fiction novel. Think about that. Now, Dune was actually just meant to be a standalone novel, so you do not need to read any other Dune novel. Most people will also read the second and third novel and call it a trilogy, but it wasn't planned in a complete story arc. In other words, Herbert didn't plan out a 3-book series. He did one book, then he did another book, then he did another book. Each book is based on what happened in the past, but it's not a complete story arc. And of course, there are more than just those 3 books. And full disclosure, I read God Emperor of Dune and was kind of depressed by it, and I haven't read any books further. But I believe there are 2 more books by Frank Herbert, and then his son picked up the storyline and wrote, I don't know how many books are out there, but there's a lot of books out there. My point is, I think I have a point. My point is that Dune is a standalone novel. The other 2 books that follow it, by the way, that are considered a trilogy are Dune Messiah and Children of Dune. Now, those next 2 books is actually Frank Herbert revisiting the world of Dune and developing what he saw as inherent tragic flaws in his original story. Anyway, if you are interested in science fiction, this is a must-read novel, in my opinion. It really impacted me when I read it, and I was about the age of Paul Atreides at the start of Dune, around 15 years old, and it had a big impact on me. So let's talk about the writing. The writing is easy to read. Remember, this was first written as a serialized version for a speculative fiction magazine, not some literary journal. There's not a lot of purple prose, the pacing is fast, and the events move quickly. Now, Dune is written in the omniscient third person, which is not a style that you see very often these days. Mostly you see limited third person, which means you only see the story from one character's perspective. In omniscient third person, The author can jump around to anyone's perspective. Generally, you jump around to the thoughts of several characters in every chapter. Now, speaking of chapters, at the beginning of every chapter, there is a little quote from the works of Princess Irulan, and it's fictional works, of course, but it was the first time I've ever seen a book framed in that manner. And I'm not sure if Frank Herbert was the first person to do this, but I'm pretty sure he was the first person who popularized it. And you see that influence in other writers, like I just read Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson, and Sanderson does the exact same thing that Herbert did at the start of each chapter. The other thing that stands out for the writing is the dialogue. It comes across as very formal. It almost sounds like it's stilted, but I think this gives the story more of a mythic quality, like you're reading the Odyssey or something like that. It brings a certain gravitas to the story, at least it did for me. Now, maybe some people find this dry, but for me, it works with this story. So what about the world building? Okay, I'm not going to give any spoilers for the plot, but I do want to discuss the world building and the main character of Paul Atreides. So if you would rather read Dune and figure this all out on your own, feel free to click off on this video now. But if you don't mind, or if you've read Dune already, stick around. Okay, here's a confession. I haven't read Dune in several decades. But I have seen the David Lynch movie adaptation several times, and somehow I absorbed some of the movie facts as book facts, which came as a big surprise to me when I reread Dune, and that's a good thing. It meant that there were surprises on the reread, and I think I was able to enjoy the book more because of that. Now let's get this out of the way, because I got into trouble from some commenters in my Dune trailer reaction when I mentioned Dune may have been a little bit sexist, so let me clarify what I meant by that. Dune was written in 1965, and it had very defined roles for genders, and it was a patriarchal, male-dominated society insofar that the rulers and leaders were all men, and women were concubines or spouses or mothers rather than having careers. Now that does not mean that there weren't strong female characters. In fact, my favorite characters were Jessica, Paul's mother, and Alia. So this brings us to the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood. Arguably, this organization of women were the most powerful force in Dune society, though their power was more behind the scenes, or behind the throne. Thanks to Spice, the Bene Gesserit had some prescient supernatural powers, which they used to further their goal of breeding a Superman, the Kwisatz Haderach, who was a human male trained as a Bene Gesserit who could spiritually travel into a dark place where women couldn't go. And this dark space hid a future that the Bene Gesserit couldn't see. Now, not only were the Bene Gesserit master manipulators in order to further their breeding program, they basically controlled all religion. For example, on Dune, a Bene Gesserit in the far past seeded the planet with what they called the Missionaria Protectiva, which basically starts a religion with certain rites and mythos which future Bene Gesserits could exploit if they ever found themselves on that planet. And Lady Jessica, Paul's mother, who was a Bene Gesserit as well, was able to use that for her own survival. Of course, nowadays we might wonder, why didn't they just use genetic engineering? Again, this was in 1965, before genetic engineering was really on anyone's radar. And this brings us to the technology of Dune, which sometimes feels a little antiquated, or at least very mechanical. And one reason for that is that computers are banned. There is a policy against thinking machines, but instead they have humans trained from birth to be Mentats, whose mental abilities are enhanced through drugs. And I thought the drug was spice, but apparently not. Thanks, Dune the movie. Anyway, Mentats are basically human computers.
Sector 680, copy the 6th, the 7th, the 8th, the quadrant of the 9th, plus 84 circles, weave the 8 and call the 4th. Copy.
And Paul, by the way, is trained as both a Bene Gesserit and a Mentat. Foreshadow. Now finally there is the Space Guild, who are the big users of spice, which allows them to kind of see into the future, though not as well as the Bene Gesserits, but most importantly, it allows them to fold space. And the Empire would not be possible without the Space Guild. And the Space Guild wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for spice. Now the Spacing Guild is probably the most mysterious organization in Dune. They don't like to get involved in politics. They're very cautious, and they seem to be only interested in business or economics where spice is concerned.
The spice must flow.
Okay, I've gone on long enough about Dune. If you haven't guessed, Dune gets my blessing. I really enjoyed rereading it, though again, my enjoyment also derives from the fact that I have a strong nostalgic affection for Dune. So if you have read Dune, let me know in the comments what you thought. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.